Okay, so the next study we're going to look at is by Grant et al. So again, remember there's 3 or more researchers, so Grant and others. And it was done in 1998, and it is on memory. So it's on something called context-dependent memory for meaningful material, and it's aimed to help students, really. So context-dependent memory is a psychological phenomenon. So the context of something could mean a number of things. So I'm currently sat in a room at college. So being in college is a context that I'm in at the moment. Also some of the displays that are on the wall are relevant pieces of context. So the context can be things like the environment, the things around you, but also it could be like internal context. So I'm quite tired today, so that could be like a state-dependent bit of context, or something about me. Okay, so context is things which occur at the time that you are encoding some information. So if I'm sat here trying to remember a list of words, then the fact that I'm in college and all these displays around me, and the fact that I'm quite tired, could end up being part of that memory that I'm trying to form. Okay, so context-dependent memory is about how sometimes your memory might be affected by whether you're in that same context or a different context. So if I'm learning this list of words in this room, but then I get taken to the top of Pendle Hill, and I'm sat on the top of Pendle Hill, and they go, right, record this list of words, and now I'm not in college anymore, I don't have those displays around me, I might not be feeling tired, I've just walked up Pendle Hill, I might be feeling like really energised, and so my memory might be different, it might be affected because I've not got that same setting to boost my memory. So it's kind of like when you go into your kitchen, knowing what you want out of your kitchen, and then you get there and you think, don't know what I came in here for, so you turn around and you go back to your lounge where you came from, and then suddenly you think, oh yeah, I wanted a sandwich. So being in the same context can boost your memory, it can act as a cue for your memory. So that's what context-dependent memory is. So if I'm sat on top of Pendle Hill, I might not be able to remember the words, but then if you bring me back here, I might go, oh yeah, so it was potato, labyrinth, media, okay? So I pick up the words. So we're going to talk about some of the theory behind that. So this is all background information for Grant's study. So we've talked about encoding and retrieval of memory with some other studies. So encoding being how you convert that memory into a suitable storage format, and retrieval being you accessing that information, or what we would call remembering. So Thomas and Tulding proposed the idea that memory is best when information provided at encoding is also present at retrieval. So my memory of that list of words would be best if I was sat in this same classroom, because I'd have all these displays around me, and I'm in college, compared to if I was sat on the top of Pendle Hill trying to recall it, because that information that was there when I was encoding it is now not present. So it can be context dependent in terms of the environment, but it can also be state dependent. So you have to be in the same internal state sometimes during retrieval and encoding. So things like when you go out at the weekend and you get drunk and you don't remember what's happened, but then next time you're drunk you might remember that information again. Okay, so here we've got a little diagram. So sober at learning, and the darker colour is sober at recall. So you can see this has got better recall than if you're sober at learning and drunk at recall. And similarly, if you're drunk at learning, sorry, but then you're sober when you're trying to recall the information, you can't remember it. But then if you're drunk when you're trying to recall the information, you can remember it. Okay, so the internal state is the same. And same here with things like mood. So if I'm sad when I'm encoding the information, I'm also sad when I'm retrieving the information, the recall's better. If I'm neutral when I'm encoding and neutral when I'm retrieving, it's better, and the same with happy. Okay, so the internal state could influence how much information you recall, but it also could be the context around you. So I'm just going to play this video in lesson. So in lesson we're going to have a go at a little experiment with some different words, and we will see if we can see this encoding specificity principle. So like we said, when you've lost something, like if you lose your house keys, think about what you go and do. You generally go back to the place where you last had them, or retrace your steps. So context-dependent memory is related to this encoding specificity principle. So your encoding specificity principle is what we said about how information that is there at encoding should also be there at recall if your memory is going to be the best. Okay, so context dependent memory is when we see that you actually have improved recall if the context at encoding and retrieval are matching compared to mismatching. So if I couldn't recall the words on top of Pendle Hill, but then I come back to this classroom and I'm sat here and I suddenly can recall the words, then that is demonstrating that I've got context-dependent memory. Okay. So there's a few studies, background studies, that have looked at context-dependent memory. So one is Godden and Baddeley. So Godden and Baddeley had divers, deep sea divers. They got the divers to be in different conditions. So some of them would learn words in separate conditions. So some of them learned words on underwater, and some of them learned a list of words on land. And then they were asked to recall them, and they then either recalled those words underwater or on land. So they were encoding and retrieving information in matching or mismatching conditions. So matching would be if I've learned on land and I'm recalling on land, or if I've learned underwater and I'm recalling underwater. And then your mismatching would be I've learned on land but now I'm recalling underwater, or I've learned underwater and now I'm recalling on land. Now what they found was that the memory for the word list learned underwater was better when recall was underwater. So changing the context, that environmental context between encoding and retrieval, reduced the diver's ability to recall learned words. Okay, so they're demonstrating context-dependent memory. If the contexts at encoding and retrieval are the same, then their memory is better. Okay, however, you've got some other studies that suggest that context isn't, if it isn't important to that actual memory, then the effects are reduced. So if it's just a list of random words that don't relate to water or to diving, perhaps, then it's not going to have that large an effect. But if it's to do with diving, things like oxygen or fish or flippers, then the context is important. Okay, so that's what some studies suggest. Okay, also if there is a delay in learning and recall, then it is recommended sometimes to vary the setting in which information is being mastered, as it aids memory by adding a host of contextual cues. So when your teachers tell you that you should revise everywhere, like revise at home, revise in college, revise on the bus, revise in Costa Coffee, other coffee shops are available, it will it will basically form this like network of contextual memories, so that you've got loads of things which could boost your memory. So you've been on the bus learning for a test, and then actually, like, when you're sat in the classroom and the windows open and the sound of traffic going by, that could be a contextual cue that could boost your information, because you could hear lots of traffic when you were trying to recall it. Or because you've been in a coffee shop, like the smell of coffee, or even having a drink can boost your memory, or being with particular people, being in college. So all of these could be cues that boost your memory. And if you know that you're not going to be tested for a long time, so like with the information you learn in class, and then you're going to be tested on that in May, if you spend your time in between now and then revising in loads of different places, it's said to form this web of context cues which could help your memory in future. Okay, and then there's another element which could affect the level of context-dependent memory, and that is known as source monitoring. So Johnson had the source monitoring framework, and that suggests that an individual's ability to actually remember the source of an episode, so like the source of the information or where they learned that information, will affect the likelihood of a memory being recalled. So I guess it's kind of like reminding you of the context of that situation. So if we've had a particular lesson, so say when we've been looking at another study, so like Baron Cohen, we've been looking at autism, and you're like, I don't remember that lesson, and I don't remember the fact from that study because I don't remember the lesson. But then somebody might give you contextual cues, so they might say, well, do you not remember we watched Rain Man, and then while we were watching Rain Man, we were eating some Haribo, and there was that really loud car outside, and it kept like playing music and peeping its horn in the middle of the film, and then suddenly it forms this picture, and then you suddenly remember the source of that information, and then you can remember sometimes the information that you're trying to remember because you can remember the source. So that's what source monitoring is about. So if you can remember where you originally and how you originally learnt that information, it might affect the likelihood of you recalling that specific piece of information compared to if you can't remember where you learnt it and how you learnt it. So in the case of context-dependent memory, this suggests that the effects of context on memory may also be limited by cognitive factors such as the ability of individuals to differentiate between individual contexts, such as reality or a dream or imagination, or if this was spoken, seen, or written. So, in other words, context can affect your memory. There can be elements of context-dependent memory, but there might be differences between people based on their own cognitive factors and cognitive processes. Okay, so context could be important, but there's other factors there as well. Okay. So Grant is interested in determining whether environmental context dependency effects would be found with the type of material and type of tests typically encountered in school. So a lot of these studies we've looked at previously on context dependent memory have used lists of random words. Now, this isn't the kind of information that you particularly look at. You look at what we call meaningful information. So it's information in texts, in paragraphs, information related to job roles or careers. So it's meaningful information. It's not just a random list of words. Okay, now why they're doing this is observations show that in many high schools and colleges we study information in environments very different to those in which we are tested. Okay, so you end up learning in like noisy classrooms, or when you're revising like with the TV on in the background or with loads of music on. And then actually when you're tested, it's usually in a silent exam hall. Okay, so because of this observation, what Grant is looking to show is that environmental context can have a positive effect, that should be effect, not affect, on the performance when the test takes place in the same environment in which the information is to be remembered. So the matching condition compared to the mismatching condition. So when we are learning and studying and revising, if you're doing it in silence, and then obviously you're going to be tested in silence, your performance is going to be better than if we have a really noisy classroom and you're learning with music and the TV and stuff on, which would be the mismatching condition. Okay, right, so what we're going to do is just sort of briefly recap all that background information there and talk about the study. So context dependency effects on memory for lists of unrelated words have been shown with recall often rather than recognition. So recall and recognition would be different. So if you were looking at multiple choice questions, often you're recognizing the word and go, oh yeah, that's the one. Whereas if it was a short answer question, you have to actually remember that information yourself, so that's recall. So context dependency for meaningful text material was examined using two standard academic testing techniques, so short answer questions and multiple choice questions. So because previous studies have just noted that lists of words are recalled better, more than recognised better, we're going to look at that meaningful information, like I said, so information from a paragraph of text rather than a list of random words. And we're going to ask participants to do short answer questions where they're recalling information for themselves, and also some multiple choice questions to see if that finding is different with meaningful information. So you've got 40 participants who are reading an article in either silent or noisy conditions, and then their reading comprehension is assessed later on with these types of tests, with short answer and multiple choice questions. Okay, so both tests show this context dependency effect, that your memory is better in the matching conditions compared to the mismatching conditions, and we therefore think that context cues appear to be important in the retrieval of newly learned meaningful information. Okay. So again, just looking back at some of the background, so these context dependency effects occur for different types of memories, which suggest that characteristics of the environment are encoded as part of the memory trace. And the fact that context dependency effects are more easily obtained with recall tests has been used to suggest that there are different processes when it comes to retrieval and recall and recognizing information. Okay, so the researchers said they collectively observed, like we said, that the study environments and the test environments of students are very different, because students often revise with background music, with friends and with family and the television on, and then the test environments are usually silent. And if we can prove that context dependency occurs with meaningful information, then we can show that actually your study habits as students might be harming your performance. So they have chosen to manipulate the presence or absence of background noise rather than music, purely because everybody's got different preferences with music. So for those of you that like R&B, if I made you listen to pop music or to heavy metal, then that might actually worsen your performance. But again, those of you that like classical music, if I made you listen to R&B, that might worsen your performance. Whereas if you like R&B and you're listening to R&B, actually it might end up affecting your performance positively, because it affects the amount that you can concentrate on what you're reading. Okay, so rather than having that variable of like music preferences, they didn't use music. Okay, so it's really important that they didn't use music, because every year students, right, they use music in this study and they didn't. That is incorrect information. So they manipulated the presence or absence of background noise. Okay. Now the aim. Okay, so they're aiming to show that environmental context can have a positive effect in a meaningful memory test when the test takes place in the same environment compared to the one that they are recalling the information in. So the matching conditions compared to the mismatching conditions. Okay, so it's a lab. So IVs are manipulated, DVs are measured in a controlled environment. So there's 2 IVs and 1 DV there. So your first IV is whether the participant read the 2-page article under silent or noisy conditions. So where they're encoding the information. And the second IV is where the participant is tested in matching or mismatching conditions. So IV1, where they read it silent or noisy, and IV2 is whether the conditions are matching or mismatching. Not whether they're silent or noisy, but whether they are matching or mismatching. Okay, so it could be matching conditions are silent, silent, or noisy, noisy, and the mismatching would be silent, noisy, and noisy, silent. Okay, the DV, so what they're measuring is the participant's performance through the scores on the short answer recall test and the multiple choice recall test. Okay, now it's an independent measures design, so we don't want people to figure out the aim, so we are just putting them in one condition or the other. So they're either learning in the noisy or the silent condition, and they are either recalling then in the matching or the mismatching. Okay, so they're not taking part in both. So the sample. So we end up with 8 members of a psychology lab who are going to serve as experimenters. So the 8 members of the psychology lab did not take part in the study. They conducted the study. Okay. They're the experimenters. So each experimenter recruits 5 acquaintances to serve as participants. Meaning it ends up in some ways being a snowball sample. Now this is a difficult one because it depends on how you explain it in an exam. So yes, it's a snowball sample in the sense of they are recruiting their friends. So when it comes to asking me how the participants are recruited, this is how they did it. So because they went and recruited 5 acquaintances, it looks like a snowball sample. However, the sample in general could be classed as an opportunity sample because they're just looking for who's available at the time of the study, their mates. Okay, so that one really depends on how you word it. Now they end up with 39 participants. So they did have 40, but 1 participant ends up being omitted from the research. So they have 39. They range from 17 to 56. The mean age is 23.4 and the standard deviation is 5.9. So on average, each person deviates by 5.9 years. 17 females and 23 males. Okay, so each of the 8 experimenters are running 1 participant for each 4 conditions, and then an additional 1 that is randomly assigned to them, and also they have a randomly assigned condition. So I'm like experimenter 1 out of 8, so I'm going to run 1 silent person, 1 noisy, 1 noisy silent, and 1 silent noisy. And then I'm going to get randomly given a fifth participant and randomly given a fifth condition. So I might randomly get given participant number 34. And then also I'm going to get randomly given noisy. So I'm running 5 in total, but I'm running 1 for each 4 and then 1 additional randomly allocated person. Okay, now they end up using 3 types of stimuli in this study. So stimuli, things which are presented to them in the environment. So they've got a cassette tape of background noise that was recorded during lunchtime in a cafeteria. They have some reading material, which was an article on psychoimmunology, and a test which had 60 multiple choice and 10 short answer questions. So you need to know about each of those different stimuli because you could be asked to describe each one. So we're going to talk about each one. So the first thing is the cassette tape. So each experimenter provides their own cassette player and their own headphones. Okay, not earphones, but headphones. The 8 cassettes were exact copies made from a master tape of background noise during a lunchtime in a university cafeteria. So the background noise consisted of occasional distinct words or phrases embedded with a general conversational hum, which was intermixed with the sounds produced by movements of chairs and dishes. And this was played at a moderately loud level. So in other words, over a busy lunchtime, in a university cafeteria, they recorded the sounds. So you couldn't hear full conversations, but you could hear the odd, distinct word. And then you had noises of like chairs scraping, dishes clinking, things like that, and just like a hum of the fact that there's conversation going on. So they recorded this on 1 tape, and then they made 8 copies of that tape. Okay. No, that's the noise. Now, the second thing is the 2-page, 3-columned article on psychoimmunology. Okay, and that was written by Hales in 1984. This was the material that they are studying, that they're going to be tested on later. And then how they're tested. So they've got the 16 multiple choice questions, which consists of a STEM and 4 alternatives. So just like the multiple choice questions that you've experienced in your own exams. So it might say, an example is grant study is A, lab experiment, B, field experiment, C, case study, D, observation. Okay, so that's how it would be sort of set out. And all of these points that are tested and memory from the things that were in that psychoimmunology text. And then they've got 10 short answer questions. So they're derived from the multiple choice stems. So instead of saying the research method in grant is A and giving you options, it would say, what is the research method used in grant? Something like that. And these stems could easily be answered unambiguously by a single word or phrase. So that's all you needed in answering them, was a single word or phrase. Now, the order of the questions followed the order that they were presented in the text. So things that were at the start of the text were questions sort of 1 and 2, and things that were at the end would be questions like 9 and 10. And the short answer test is always administered first, rather than the multiple choice, because what you don't want is to find that people are recalling in those short answer questions things from the multiple choice questions, because multiple choice questions can prompt your memory. So if you don't know the research method in grant, then that would be clear by the fact that you don't know what to write when asked in a short answer question. But when you've got a multiple choice question, you've got 4 options, and so if I gave you that multiple choice question first, when it comes to answering that short answer question later on, you could just put one of those down and you'd have a 25% chance of getting it right. Okay, so the short answers were given first. So we'll just run through the order in which things were presented in this study. So first, instructions are given, describing the experiment as a class project and stating that participation is voluntary. These are read aloud. Participants were asked to read the given article once, as if they were reading it for a class assignment. They were allowed to highlight it and underline it, but they could only read it once. Participants were informed that their comprehension would be tested in short answers and multiple choice. All participants wore the headphones while they read, regardless of whether they were silent or noisy. In the first IV, they all wore the headphones to standardise it. Those that were in the noisy condition, though, were told that they would hear moderately loud background noise, but should ignore it, and those in the silent were told that they wouldn't hear anything. And then the reading times were recorded by the experimenters. So how long you took to read it was recorded, but you could only read it once. Then they were told to do nothing for 2 minutes. So they're given a break of 2 minutes to minimise recall from short-term memory. We're trying to remember information and retrieve information from the long-term memory, because that's what students do. Hope at least you don't go and just read all of your notes in the 30 seconds before you enter your exam, although some of you do. And the short answer test is given, followed by the multiple choice test, and then participants read the tested in the matching or mismatching conditions. Again, they all wear headphones regardless of whether it's silent or noisy, and they're told which condition they are in before they complete it. Then they are debriefed, and the whole thing lasts about 30 minutes. Okay, so that is what happened. Alright, so now we're looking at the results. Okay, so we've got quantitative data here. So we're looking at scores, right and wrong. So when it comes to the reading time, the differences between the conditions were not significant. So it didn't take you longer if you had background noise, and you went quicker if you were in the silent condition. Although reading time did vary between individual participants. Now, they recorded the reading time because they wanted to just check if it was potentially like a co-variable or a third variable, to see if those who spent longer reading it could recall more, or if it was affected by whether you were in silent or noisy, essentially. Okay, so we've got some mean scores for the short answer questions. Remember, short answer questions came first. So these are the mean scores, so remember these. So in the silent condition, it was 6.7, silent noisy 5.4, noisy silent 4.6, and silent noisy sorry, it's 6.2. Okay. So you've got better recall there on the matching conditions compared to the mismatching conditions, which are these two, matching and mismatching. Okay, and for the multiple choice questions out of 16, so these ones are easy to remember because the matching conditions, they scored 14.3, both of them, and the mismatching conditions, they both scored 12.7. Okay, so in conclusion, there are context dependency effects for newly learned meaningful material, regardless of whether you're looking at recognition or recall, so short answer or multiple choice. So we saw that matching conditions in both were better than mismatching conditions. Okay. Studying and testing in the same environment can lead to enhanced performance, and therefore students are likely to perform better in exams if they study for them with a minimum of background noise, because even though there was overall no effect of noise, so we're not saying that revising with music on or with noise and friends and family around you worsens your memory. What we are saying is, because there's evidence of context dependent memory, and we know that you're going to be tested in silence without any background noise, then you should revise in silence to get the best out of your memory. Okay, so there's the study. So I'll give you a second. I want you to have a go at writing the reference. Now we've done referencing. and there's the reference. Okay, so again, that's pretty much it for the study. We'll evaluate it in full next lesson, but I'm just going to run through a few points here and there. So it's a lab experiment, so it's standardized, it's controlled, it's replicable, which means it's reliable, but then also we've got the fact that it's useful. So the aim of the study is to help students, and actually it is helping students because it's telling us how we can help them revise and therefore boost their memory. It's got construct validity, so because we are testing them with the short answer question first, we're making sure that they're recalling the information from the article, not the information from the multiple choice test, so we know we're testing what we set out to test. So that's construct validity. It's got criterion validity, so the significance of the results, we've got quite a large age range, which suggests that memory is constant over time, so it doesn't matter whether you test this with young students or with people who are middle-aged, you will always see that context dependency effect. We've got quantitative data, that's easy to use for statistical analysis, make comparisons from, and it's quite ethical. So we've got informed consent, they've got the right to withdraw, they're told that participation is voluntary, so they don't have to, and they're debriefed at the end. But low ecological validity, and also not really a representative sample, because again, if it's students recruiting people they know, it's probably going to be students, they're probably all going to be from the same area, so there's quite a few things going on there. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the study, so make sure you've got really thorough notes. I'll be checking those notes in your next lesson, and we'll go on to evaluate this study in full and apply it to some exam questions as well.